Hi, welcome to another podcast of Sign Action. This podcast I will translate additionally in German and also in Russian. The topic of this podcast is scientific thinking. So, this topic is very important to me, and in the last few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about this, and it's important to me because I think this scientific thinking method has shaped me as a person, I would say, the most. And I would also like to express my personal opinion why I think that this scientific way of thinking would be beneficial for more people to try to practice. So I have to mention a small caveat in this podcast with respect to all that I say is exclusively just my opinion. So you can right away say that, okay, this podcast is not scientific, so I can turn it off. And yes, the answer would be yes, you can definitely do that. It's not scientific, it's purely my opinion. It can be completely false because I'm not presenting any empirical data. So I'm not going to be talking about, the 1,000 scientists whom I have surveyed and, asked them to fill out any sort of forms. And then I have not done the same for the people who are not scientists to try to, statistically compare if one group thinks more scientifically than the other. So I do not have this data. All I have are personal observations throughout my life. So this is more of a philosophical, I guess, delving into sort of the philosophy of science a little bit. Now, I'm not a philosopher, so you have to excuse sort of my loose usage of philosophical terms in this podcast. So, moving on further, scientific thinking, what is it to me? Basically, for me, it is the way that you use to make statements about what you believe reality is. It is the way of thinking that is thought to give you the best or the most accurate model of reality. So, what I mean by model of reality? Well, obviously, we can never be 100% sure of anything. However, the best estimation of reality, of how things happen, how natural processes work, which political governance system is the best, who is the best actor, I mean, any question in reality that you may have, the argument for scientific thinking is that thinking about such a question in a scientific manner will most likely bring you to the best possible estimation of reality or the best solution to a particular problem. And obviously, it has pros and cons. Pros, I think it reduces your bias, right? So let's say your entire life you have only lived in one particular country. If you use the scientific thinking method of coming to a conclusion about a particular question, then you will not only look at, let's say, news and scientific research articles from your country, right? So you will try to look at data available from across the globe, from different scientific communities. You will try to speak to people of all walks of life, people who share your view, people who do not share your view, getting a range of diverse opinions as possible. So that is one pro of scientific thinking. Another is always trying to think, okay, if you come to a certain conclusion, what would enable you to actually prove your conclusion false? So let's say you believe that England has the worst weather. I'm using this example because this is where I have bias. I think England has bad weather, but if I really reflect on it, then I realize that I think that England has bad weather mostly because of hearsay. I've met so many people who've always told me that England has really bad weather. And, I read it in the news and in all the movies where you have some scenes from England, usually bad weather, raining. So I would say if I employ this scientific thinking method, okay, my opinion is that England has bad weather. However, my confidence level is not going to be extremely high that England has bad weather until I research this, or at least read some reports or scientific articles which show that, let's say, over the last 50 or 100 years, annually, the most number of rainy days occur in England, at least in Europe, for example. If that is the case, I would say then my confidence level should increase. So basically, the point here is I have a belief England has rainy weather, and this belief is testable. So I'm able to actually look at the data on the weather in England and compare the number of rainy days compared to other countries, and then see if my belief is warranted or not. So that was the first point about reducing the bias. The next point is, for me personally, a very important one, and that is that, in my opinion, scientific thinking leads to better conflict resolution. And what I mean by conflict resolution here is, on the one side, just conflicts when you are arguing with colleagues or friends or family members, and you have some kind of a conflict, and lots of times the conflict arises, in my opinion, because scientific thinking is not being employed. Lots of times I see conflict arising based on postulations and points that are not based on scientific evidence, largely based on emotions. So I believe that conflict resolution using scientific thinking is satisfactory for the most number of parties involved. In the scientific community, if there is a disagreement, what usually happens is, let's say, someone publishes a scientific paper, and in this scientific paper, another scientist reads this and he does not agree with the results of the paper. Well, the method that he chooses to resolve this conflict is he writes a response to the article, and let's say he believes that he may know some potential reasons why the results of his colleagues are different than his, and that the conclusions that his colleagues come to are erroneous. So what he does then is he accurately reads all other papers on the topic. He cites them as points of support for his critique of the paper. He also shows his own results from his own experiments, which do not agree with the results of the critiqued paper. And he writes all this as a response in the form of a response letter. And he sends this letter to the scientific journal, which had published the original paper. And even before his response to the critique paper gets published, it gets sent to 2 to 3 other scientists who go through his letter and check that the references that he provides, so other sources of information, are credible. They check that his arguments are logical, that they make sense. They check that his results that he presents are also believable and seem to be methodologically sound. And only after it gets approved by these reviewers, then this response to the critique paper also gets published, and then the original authors read this critique of their findings, and they can respond to this. This is obviously the most sort of long-winded way of doing this, what more commonly happens is that at conferences where researchers meet, they pose questions to each other, obviously without having to go through this long process. However, I have never encountered different scientists arguing about a particular question or a particular result that led to a real personal conflict. And I think the reason behind this is that all scientists usually apply the same scientific thinking method to evaluate the argument of the other person. And if they are simply not able to come to a conclusion, then they end the conversation by saying that, okay, it is interesting that your lab came to a different result than our lab. And if we have not been able to come to a possible conclusion why our results are different, we will have to do more experiments or think about this further to try to resolve why we have these different points of view. That's usually where it ends. And on the other hand, what I often observe among friends and family members, and just really talking with people who do not employ the scientific thinking, is that you often get statements made with insufficient data. However, the people making these statements do not realize this. So the statements that they make do not go through this mental sort of a filtering technique where they try to first critically examine their own conclusions, trying to basically disprove their own convictions themselves. So there should be ways that you can first disprove your convictions yourself to increase your confidence level. And if a person making a statement has no way of coming up with possible tests or other sources of data that he can look at to try to disprove his conviction or his hypothesis, then such conviction and statement should be either not made or made with a caveat. So the person should only make such a statement via such a caveat as, okay, I realize that this is an emotional response. I would not be willing to make public statements about this or have a real sort of a debate. I would not put a stake or bet anything on my conviction about this particular topic at hand. I think people who employ the scientific method more often than not, at the end of stating their conviction, will present a confidence level of what they're presenting. And what I usually observe is people who do not employ the scientific thinking make usually emotional and strong convictions about particular topics and questions without having thought of ways to first disprove their convictions if they had tried to disprove them, and what evidence there is for and against it, and then just letting the statement come across as a very convinced and highly likely accurate description of reality. To summarize it, I think that scientific thinking leads to a more accurate proportioning of your confidence to your convictions. And I think this is important because if you realize that your conviction about a certain topic or question is low or lower compared to others, you will not be as emotionally invested in trying to convince other individuals about your opinion. And I think that one should only start trying to convince others about one's opinion only after real careful experimentation and data analysis and data collection, and after lots of viewpoints have been considered and information sources have been considered and analyzed, that you really should attempt at convincing others about your particular view. The cons, obviously, about scientific thinking is it's harder. I mean, I'll put it frankly, it's harder than just to say, I know it's so. It's a lot harder to say, I don't know. It's a lot harder to say, I don't have enough evidence and I don't have an opinion on this. It's easier just to say, I heard it on the news, I heard it on the radio, I read it in some paper, someone told me, a very famous person told me, a very important person has told me, and that's why I know. So the con of scientific thinking is that it's a lot more time consuming to come to any conclusion about anything. I think that is the biggest con. And one has to realize that scientific thinking is not always possible. So if every morning you wake up and let's say once a week you water your plants. Now, you can take this scientific thinking method to the extreme and never water your plants unless you prove the water content of the soil with 10 different devices and ask 10 different individuals to carry out the same testing process as you to test the water quality of the soil, and only if all of the 10 different individuals using these 10 different devices come to the same conclusion that the water moisture level is below a particular point required for the optimal growth of your plant, only then will you water your plant. Now, this is also scientific thinking, and it will increase your confidence level and the probability that the plant will really suffer if you do not water it at this time to an extreme, right? I mean, your confidence level will then be 99.9999999% that the plant needs water. So in this case, basically employing this scientific thinking is so time consuming that if you employed it for everyday things like this, you would not get very far in life. You would not be able to accomplish much. Your whole life, you would be basically gathering more data to increase your confidence level. So at a certain point, you have to stop, obviously, and say, I'm satisfied with the confidence level that I have to make a conviction or make a statement or carry out an action, and then you just do it. I mean, you also have to look at the consequences. Certain things like, is a plane going to take off or not? I think you should invest more time in checking the plane than to check if your plant really needs water. If it didn't and then you water it anyway, well, nothing bad will happen with the plane. If you don't check it thoroughly enough, a catastrophe can happen. So you have to weigh also obviously the outcomes of what you say and the actions that you take based on the time that you spend researching whether a certain action is required or not. So that's, I think, the biggest con of the scientific method is that you will never reach the 100% confidence. More data and more research is always possible, and sometimes, quite often, this cutoff point is difficult to detect. But I think if you are honest and in conveying your decision and what sort of level of evidence has convinced you and why you stopped researching at a particular point and then came to your conclusion or conviction or carried out your act, I think if you convey that honestly, then that is the best way of communicating how you came to your conviction and what sort of level of confidence you have about something. If scientific thinking is not employed in coming to a conviction on any topic, then the probability that you are closer to an accurate model of the truth or reality will always be lower. And that is because if you do not go through this process of trying to yourself first disprove your your hypothesis or conviction using external data or additional experimentation, then it leaves the sources of your conviction very limited, and it increases the bias that you may have. So, to put it all together, I think that when forming your opinion about a particular topic or coming to a certain conviction, you should trust an internationally recognized expert in some field. Obviously, his opinion has more weight when he gives his opinion about a particular topic than, let's say, your own when you're just forming an opinion. However, in the end, if it's still just him making a certain statement or observation, then your confidence should not be as high, because that is one scientist, and everyone still has a certain bias. But the more agreement you have among different scientists and different researchers, the more you can be certain that the conviction that they hold is more closer to the truth.